Hello and very good morning to everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Friday morning. I'm happy to welcome you to the second out of 3 conversations that we have planned for early December, and which focus on the world's middle powers, such as Turkey or Saudi Arabia or South Africa, and what they think about the emerging global order. My name is Pawel Zerka, and I know very little about any of the 3 countries in question. However, I know quite a bit about the public opinion data, as I am ECFR's lead data analyst. And therefore, I will use the results of ECFR's latest public opinion poll, which we conducted in September and October in 11 European countries, as well as 10 countries outside Europe. I will use it as a starting point for a discussion about something strange happened. Okay. Sinan, if you could give me a sign if you are... Okay. I don't know at which stage I disappeared, but I was presenting both you and Vesela, who is our deputy director at ECFR and is also head of our Sofia office. I hope we are still at in the meeting group and that people can hear us. Something strange must have happened technically. The ambitious plan for the next 30 minutes is to have 3 parts, each of them around 10 minutes long. First, I will do a data insights round with you. Then we'll do an analysis round with Sinan and Vesela. And finally, we'll do questions and answers with the audience. And my speakers, Vesela and Sinan, have already been warned that I will keep to those timings and there will be no pity on my side. So let me also encourage you, the audience, to ask your questions early on in the webinar chat. And if you have any feedback about the format of this event, with which we are still only experimenting, then just please pop me an email. But now, as promised, let me start with a couple of graphics, which we will use as a starter, and then we'll have Sinan and Vesela as the main dish. So Turkey, we may consider Turkey as a good example of what my colleagues Mark Leonards, Ivan Krastev, and Timothy Gartonash have called an a la carte world, which is composed of countries that enjoy the freedom of not needing to choose any political alignment with either the West or China or others. As you can see on this pie chart, 55% of people in Turkey believe that it's realistically possible for their country to have good relations with both China and the US. And there is less than a quarter, 24%, that say that this is not possible. Such a perspective is shared in many other places too, in many other middle powers. It's actually even more strongly marked in Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, South Africa, or Brazil. But it's also present in Turkey. Then, depending on the subject in question, people in Turkey appear to prefer a closer relationship with either the US or with China. So as you can see on this chart, they prefer America for human rights or internet governance, as well as security cooperation, but they prefer to be closer to China on trade, despite the fact that actually Turkey is trading much more with Europe than with and therefore with the West than with China. And also it's interesting perhaps to note that so many people, like 22% in Turkey, would go with China on security, and there is not just 43% who choose America, despite the fact that Turkey is, after all, a member of the NATO alliance. China seems to be particularly attractive for people in Turkey in economic terms. And Turks are very open to most of the types of Chinese economic presence in their country, such as Chinese businesses buying a Turkish company in the tech industry, or building infrastructure such as bridges and ports, buying major sports team or a newspaper in Turkey. On all of those issues, people in Turkey find it okay for the Chinese companies to be present in Turkey. And so I see that there is a funny mistake on the chart. It's of course it's about Turkey, not about Saudi Arabia. So the only exception where people in Turkey find it unacceptable to see Chinese economic presence in the country, that concerns owning infrastructure such as bridges and ports. And it's interesting to see that on this point, Turks are very much like Europeans, who also have a reluctance to consider Chinese economic presence being about the ownership of critical infrastructure. Turks, if they had to choose whether they go with America or China, most of them would choose America, but most is not like a super a lot, because it's just 51% who would side with America, and there is quite a considerable part of the population, 26%, who would actually go with China. Of course, as we know from the earlier slides, most people in Turkey don't actually believe that their country will ever need to choose. But still, it's interesting to see that in case they had to choose, they would have quite divided perceptions on this. And here, Turkey is again similar to several other middle powers like Saudi Arabia, South Africa, or Indonesia, who also would have problems choosing their allegiance, although at the same time they don't feel like that will come very quickly for them to need to choose at all. However, where Turks stand out from the rest of the middle power crowd is in the pessimism of its people about the future of their country. So here on this chart, you see the responses from different places on the question whether people are optimistic or pessimistic about their country's future. And you see on the left, most of the middle powers like India, Indonesia, China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, where people largely feel optimistic about their country's future. On the other hand, you have on your right countries like Europe, United States, South Korea, but also Turkey, where the dominating perspective is that people are pessimistic about their country future. So on this point, again, Turkey is not so much part of the other middle powers, but rather similar to Europe and the US. I have my explanation of why this is so. So here you have a breakdown of that optimism, pessimism in Turkey based on people's voting intention. So if somebody is a voter of Erdogan, they mostly are optimistic about their country's future. If, however, they would prefer to vote for the opposition, or they simply don't know how to vote, they are mostly pessimistic about the future of Turkey. However, and let me finish on this, this is pessimism nonetheless, and perhaps this is largely to be explained by the domestic politics. But I wonder whether whether we cannot also connect it to the broader foreign policy, and so my question to Sinan and to Vesela to start the discussion is whether this isn't telling us something about Turkey's difficult geopolitical position, where on the one hand, in many ways, it is enjoying the freedoms that the a la carte world provides, whereby they can have good relations with the West, be part of NATO, but at the same time have a relationship with both China and Russia. So these are the advantages of such a world. But perhaps there might be a feeling already among the Turkish population that such a situation and such a positioning is simply not sustainable. I wonder whether there is a link to foreign policy. And so let me now stop talking and ask Vesela first and Sinan to quickly tell us how you explain those data and what you find interesting more broadly in the data that they have shared with you.
I don't know whether, Pawel, you want me to go first, or shall we have Sinan go first? I can go first.
Let's start with you, Vesela, and then we'll go to Sinan.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for this data and for this conversation, because I think this is a very timely conversation, not only in the framework of our Citrus poll, but also given that there is the European Council coming up, where there will be a discussion on enlargement, among other things, but also this would be a moment when I guess the EU could, or the leaders could, consider what is the role for Turkey that they would want to have. There has been a report that was produced by the External Action Service on the relationship with Turkey. And against this background, I think our conversation is also useful. Three maybe things on my side. Beyond the data, or maybe building on it, it is quite clear that this drive by Erdogan to create a regional power, to create Turkey as an actor, to act as a power in a region which is surrounded by at least two wars and one armed conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. It is quite clear that also the public opinion is supporting this sort of hedging, policy of hedging, and not really choosing sides, being opportunistic about how to fit in the situation and how to react to it, but also not being firm in its alliances or in its partnerships. So in a way, I think the relationship to Turkey would be the litmus test for the EU, how geopolitical it can really be. So if you look at this data, as a European policymaker, you will probably say, okay, this is no more the Turkey that we have started negotiating with so many years ago, and clearly it's a kind of a frozen candidate. But given that we're discussing the enlargement, that we're discussing the Western Balkans, I believe that this data should really give us enough reason to start thinking about a new sort of relationship with Turkey and prove that the EU can be geopolitical and can be talking to its neighbors about trade within a modernization of the customs union, and also find other avenues in which to cooperate with Turkey, because clearly this trend of hedging is going to stay.
Very good. Let me move now to Sinan and your take on what you have seen and what we have discussed so far.
This has been, a very interesting set of data that I have, examined very carefully, and I will try to draw some conclusions that are relevant for our policy environment. But allow me perhaps initially a few words about why I think the case of Turkey is different compared to the other countries that are represented in the survey. First of all, compared to all the other countries, Turkey is different because it is a NATO country. It is, with all the drawbacks, nonetheless negotiating its accession to the EU. it is the only country representatives in the survey that has these deep institutional links with the Western order. So I think all the data, when we read the data and try to interpret the data, we need to be firstly aware of this difference, because knowing this would allow us to do a proper reading of the data. Secondly, I understand why the overall methodology has earmarked US and China as the two lead nations to really drive a response about what in each of these countries the population would like to see. But that is problematic in the Turkish case in a way that it may not be in other countries. And the reason is that there is a very high degree of anti-Americanism. And therefore, the responses that we get may represent maybe in a way polluted by the existing prevailing anti-Americanism, and therefore may not totally represent about where the Turkish population wants to stand in terms of its relationship to the world order. So, having Europe as well in this set of questions, US and Europe, would make more sense to me if we're polling about, what the Turkish population believes where the country should stand, as opposed to the US. Because the relationship with US is very problematic. A large part of the Turkish population see the US as having acted policies that are inimical to Turkey's at least internal security. So therefore, a lot of the responses may be shaped by that. Thirdly, on China, there is a degree of positivity that we can read, but that is also partially the outcome of the fact that China has very little visibility in Turkey, unlike some of the other countries that are polled here. So the positive response in some of these areas, and I'm particularly surprised by the data on trade, where if I'm not mistaken, if I have to go back to that, there is a quite a large about right. Let's
People
see,
would
on
feel
trade,
closer
about
to
50%. Turkey to be closer to China. That I really have difficulty in explaining and really understanding where that comes from, because that's not the reality. The reality is that obviously Turkey's economy is very much interdependent with the Western world. It has a customs union with the EU. It gets its FDI from the West, geographic West, its technology, and so on. So that 50% that want to be closer to China on trade doesn't make sense, also because Turkey's bilateral trade with China is very, very skewed. I just saw an article. I haven't checked the figures, but last week in China Morning Post, there was an article stating that the overall bilateral trade was about $39 billion, and 38 of it was China's exports to Turkey. So again, this particular, Turkey wanting to be closer to China on trade is really difficult for me to interpret. But let's move on, and and overall, what this, when you read it in its totality, what does this data tells us about the country's positioning? First, indeed, there is a willingness, an awareness, but also a willingness to really take advantage of the emerging multipolar order. There is some, but not a total alignment with the West. There's really a desire to have, sound relations with the different poles of this order. Secondly, this is a byproduct, but also a lasting, I would argue, structural component of how going forward Turkey will shape its foreign policy, where we have talked, and I think we see this in the data as well, about the pragmatism, but also the transactionalism of Turkish foreign policy. So I think that needs to be highlighted. On your question about the the pessimism where the Turkish population seems to reflect the overriding pessimism of the European population, I would say two things. One, the survey was taken in September, October, so a few months after the very critical elections in Turkey, and the outcome of the elections for one political class did lead to very high degree of pessimism. The opposition lost the election, so the opposition electorate nowadays looks at the future of the country as to the elections as a squandered opportunity to change political leadership, and therefore have turned more pessimistic about the near future of the country as a result of these elections, which many believed could have led to political change, but it did not. And then even within the ranks of the AK Party electorate, there is a degree of pessimism because of economic downturn. And so therefore we end up with the 58%, which is quite high compared to the other peer countries that are part of this survey. And finally, perhaps before we turn to the Q&A, what we get from this when you look at at all this data in its totality, is that yes, compared to perhaps, we don't have similar data compared to a decade ago, but what I think I can say is that compared to a decade ago, there's more of a willingness to seek alignment with other power centers in the world. But that also is a consequence of the fact that for the past decade, Turkey's relationship with the main partners in the West, here EU and the US, have been very problematic. Now, this is not a discussion where we should blame apportion responsibility, but I would argue that if we reach another state of affairs where these relationships start to improve, with the US on the security side, with the EU generally on the institutional and economic side, these positions will shift. And we're likely to see, respondents in Turkey starting to give more positive, messages regarding the future of the relations of Turkey with the broader West in general.
Thank you, Sinan. And actually, you have responded to many of the questions that I see in the chat, which also refer to pessimism and the economy. I believe that demography is also important here, perhaps as a factor to explain this. So it's perhaps not so much foreign policy in the case of Turkey, which is behind the pessimism of the people. Let me ask you, but also Vesela, a question, which would be about the wars in Ukraine, but also Israel-Hamas. So on the one hand, Turkey in the accession towards the EU, which perhaps is none of those sides believes could be accomplished, but still a NATO member. How far Europe and the US can count on Turkey in their support for Ukraine? What role could Turkey play here, and how much the development since the 8th October and with the war between Israel and Hamas make that problematic. And I think that we'll need to we'll have time for your reactions on this, but then we will need to close because, as promised, this is just a short 30-minute event. So again, maybe Vesela, if you want to start with this geopolitical picture and the role of Turkey in this.
I mean, clearly, Turkey was key in reaching the Green Deal, and this was maybe the only kind of diplomatic breakthrough that we saw on the Ukrainian war front. Ever since, there has been the feeling that Turkey may be really hedging between Ukraine and Russia, that it may also have a role on or not so positive role on the efficiency of sanctions and so on. But I think in the meantime, Turkey is aware that, especially within the NATO context, supporting Ukraine is going to be basically the dominant position that it will have to take vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine. And I believe there is a kind of a rebalancing there. I would be interested to hear also what Sinan thinks. On the Gaza front, it seems to have less of a role, but it will definitely have a role in the, so to say, narrative parts of this war, meaning whether this is a point of make or break for the West, whether this is a point of creating a new policy towards Palestine, but also towards the Arab world, or whether it would be a moment of kind of, I don't know, crash of the European Middle Eastern policy. I think how we articulate it, how we interpret it vis-a-vis, especially the Arab world, in that Turkey will be really very, very important as we go forward. And here I mean the Turkish communities in Germany and in other countries of Western Europe, where really this war is watched very closely. And we saw the visit of President Erdogan to Berlin was also kind of watched from that perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Vesela. Sinan, your reactions to the geopolitical context, the role of Turkey?
The Turkish, for a decade now, there is an overriding geopolitical narrative that the government has espoused. That narrative perhaps can be described as as championing multi-alignment, but also Turkey's status as a strong middle power, regional power that has a say on global issues. That narrative has captured the imagination of the Turkish public, and I don't think there is going back. So it is going to be in the context of this narrative that we shall see future steps. Some of those steps in the past has been too aggressive and ultimately inimical to Turkey's national interest. For the past 2 years, there has been a recalibration. But even then, we may see occasional, sloganized foreign policy initiatives. But ultimately, yes, Turkey has really emerged as a regional power, and this is going to shape increasingly how Turkey looks at its own role in the region, but also in relation to its ties with the West.
Thank you, Sinan. I'm terribly sorry that we need to close, but that was always the plan, to make it, to only raise the appetite of the audience for the topic in question, but not to exploit the question in full. So I need to close the discussion, and there are just two things that left for me to do. One is to thank again Vesela and Sinan for joining us, but also for being so disciplined in your interventions. I would also want to thank my colleagues Amanda Pote and Swansea Green, who masterminded this series of short discussions about middle powers. And secondly, I would like to invite you, the audience, to the final event in that series. We will discuss South Africa next Tuesday on the 12th of December at 9 a.m. CET. And for the moment, this is all, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of Friday, as well as a great weekend, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.